From the Hill Country in Texas, this is OneRadioNetwork.com.
Morning, Fred. We made it. I mean, you know.
Well, good morning, Patrick. After a few moments of technical issues, glad to be with you.
Yeah, nice to be here with you. You're in Hilton Head, right? Hilton Head?
I am. A little bit warm here, but I know in Texas you guys are experiencing the same thing. So, except for maybe Phoenix, we are amongst the hottest cities in the country right now.
Wow, yeah. They're talking 105, 106 for the weekend here. Pretty interesting.
How?
Whatever it is.
Hope your power grid holds up.
Yeah. So I was thinking about, I sent you that little bit about the interest rates from Rubino. I sent you that
Sure.
in the past week, which is pretty curious. He's saying what, in the next year or so at 5%, interest rate, which is the blended interest, right? The U.S. Gov, we the people, well, we're going to be getting close to, 1.7 trillion a year in interest
payments.
Wow. Just interest, folks. Think about that. You got your credit card and you got your interest payment, and the Treasury, we the people, 1.7, that's a T, trillion in interest payments.
And this was 900 billion just 2 years ago.
Wow. So the debt that we owe around, how did that work where it got to 1 trillion when they start raising interest? Well, they didn't start raising interest rates, though, till recently. So what am I missing?
Government spending additional money.
Oh, and borrowing at a higher rate?
Much more borrowing.
Much more borrowing.
Right. So they added a big amount to the principal, which of course increases the amount. And then as interest rates have been going up, the Fed has raised rates progressively, 10 times or so. So we've seen a massive hike in interest rates, and it is beginning to put a lot of pressure on the government's ability to repay its debt. The interest payments are expected within about 5 or 6 years to surpass the amount that the government spends on the Department of Defense. And that's going to be the first time we've experienced that. So where right now the interest payments are the second item in the government's budget after DOD, it's expected to surpass that within the next 5 or 6 years. Rubin pointed out an interesting point in that article, and it's the idea of a parabolic increase. So we went from, let's say, 400 billion in interest payments to now projected 1.7 trillion, where that may have taken 10, 15, 20 years to double. Now it's doubled in less than 2 years. And if it continues parabolic, that means that the rate at which it increases is going to accelerate really rapidly without any passage of time. And this is where we've gone from, a trillion to 1.7 trillion, and barely any time has passed. This becomes extremely dangerous because it creates an environment that's almost unsustainable. In fact, this morning, one of the credit rating agencies, Fitch, decided to downgrade the U.S. government debt from AAA down to AA+. And, I expressed concern about this, that this is an endgame problem when the credit rating agencies start to look at the environment, do the math, and say, hey, we cannot ignore this anymore. Amazingly, the dollar has sort of shrugged off Fitch's announcement, and it actually went up a little bit today. And I think this is sort of an interesting play. I wonder whether or not behind the scenes that they're trying to push up the dollar because they're concerned of this type of statement coming out from a credit rating agency. But first time in almost 20 years that one of the credit rating agencies has downgraded the U.S. government's debt and their ability to repay their funds.
We're with Fred Dashevsky. If you'd like to be on the air, phone lines are working, 888-663-6386. We're live here. It is a Wednesday morning, the 2nd of August, OneRadioNetwork.com. Charlie Sewell is going to be here at noon, and we have a little show that we have with Charlie now and then. He studies all kinds of things legally and lawfully in this country, and we kind of titled the show, How to Be Free in an Unfree World. And there's actually some interesting little paperwork you can file to give yourself a little cushion against people knocking on your front door. But we'll talk about that with Charlie. Fred, though, let me go back. I think you misspoke here. You said we're about to overtake the Defense Department spending. Well, that's only about $900 billion, isn't it? We've already overtaken that, haven't we?
Not quite. I mean, as of last year, the Department of Defense spending budget was still larger than the interest on the debts. We're crossing that line. So we're pretty close if we haven't already, but within less than a year from now, according to these expectations, and I think they're probably accurate, we're going to see that line crossed, and we're going to actually find for the first time that the interest payments that we're carrying on our national debt has become such a large problem for the government that when they budget everything that they do, that the interest payments have become, the second largest item on their budget. And yeah, that's pretty devastating when you can't even carry your principal payments and you're barely able to make interest payments. And it gets to a point where the credit rating agencies around the world are looking at the US dollar, they're looking at the amount of money that the government can generate in revenue, how fast they're spending and deficit spending, because the deficit spending has exploded. And they couple these things together and they come up with these analyses and say, hey, this is where we're heading. And, whether it's first or second, it's the numbers that are really relevant. And what scares me here is the problem that the rate at which it's accelerating, again, is almost parabolic. And at a parable, when you're at that level where no time is passing, but your debt is still increasing really rapidly, it becomes a real flawed process. And it becomes so scary that, Kevin O'Leary was on this morning talking about his experiences around as a international investor. And he was all but aggravated, I'll use the word pissed, expressing his disconcern, his discomfort with the way that the U.S. government is managing the debt. And as an international investor, he fears that this problem is going to make us look like Argentina. And the only thing stabilizing the U.S. dollar to date has been our ability to continue to sell debt. But if the world begins to look at the U.S. government and begins to question its ability to maintain that ability to continue to pay its debt, it creates a real fundamental problem because, we're surviving on our ability to be able to print more treasuries to pay for an ever accelerating amount of money that the government is spending. That's a dangerous environment.
So maybe I misunderstood. I thought you had said that we were in the 1.2 or something trillion in interest payments right now, like in the last few weeks. Did I mishear you?
I think that is correct.
Okay. So that is already over the amount of DOD.
I just don't know what the exact number for DOD is at the moment.
Yeah. I mean, I can Google it, but I think it's about $1 trillion. I think it's about $1 trillion.
It's close. So, in other words, whether it's, a touch ahead, touch behind, or pretty
Doesn't
much close to even, when you think about the Department of Defense, that's where the government should be spending money. I mean, we could argue whether or not, we should be adding more to our military spending, or whether or not America should be defending the world and utilizing all the capital and reserves when we have so many internal problems domestically we could be utilizing those funds for. But if we set all that aside and we accept the notion that this is what Congress has decided it's going to do, then we have to move forward and say, okay, so we have a Department of Defense budget and it's massive. And, from time to time they increase it. They need to buy new inventory for the military, all sorts of purposes and reasons that they have there. But, meanwhile, creeping alongside of it have been the rising interest rates. So this has been kind of a byproduct of the Federal Reserve raising rates, is that it is also increasing the cost for the U.S. government. Because when you're carrying $30+ trillion worth of bonded debt and 75 to 77 trillion in unfunded liabilities, when interest rates go up, it really dramatically increases your costs.
The whole deal.
And that is becoming a fundamental problem.
So, Fred Dashevsky, this debt will never be paid off, right? Never.
I don't think so.
No way. I mean, if you got
I don't see there's any way to do it. I mean, you could print, $40 trillion or $100 trillion and pay off everything, but that as a result would create an inflation rate that would make Argentina look like a good place to be. So we're not going to print our way out of the problem at that pace that rapidly. That would be devastating. It would be an end game issue. So we're going to have to do this over time and find ourselves with the ability to somehow create just enough money to continue the game right? Like, let's not let it fall apart, but don't print too much to create your own problem to where the inflation gets out of control. And this is kind of what the Fed has been dealing with since COVID. So it took it upon itself to say our response to COVID to stimulate economic activity is going to be to create money. And they did it at a pace that no one had ever seen. And people, including me, expressed a grave interest in the rate at which they had done this and the extent to which this would have an impact on Americans' lives. And yet they continued to do it. Now they're fighting the problem back by trying to raise interest rates enough to beat back the amount of inflation they created by printing all that money, but not do that too much to throw the economy into a significant recession, which would force them then to try to lower interest rates to fight back the problem that they've created, which was the result of trying to fight back the first problem that they created. It's becoming, a circle game.
You can't even print your way out of the problem because, as you know, and you've taught us, and Andrew, Federal Reserve prints the dollars, not Treasury. So if they create $33 trillion, loan it to the Treasury to pay off the debt, then they owe Federal Reserve Bank $33 trillion. So you're going to still have debt. I mean,
right. It just shifts from one place to another. So look at how much of new debt they had to create just to get past the last debt ceiling problem.
Yeah. Wow.
So in order to finance what they finally decided to do to get out of that problem, they ended up creating so much additional debt that the Federal Reserve added back onto its balance sheet huge amounts of bonds that it had tried to unwind. Because if you remember, about a year ago, the Fed made this ridiculous argument that it was going to bring back its balance sheet down to pre-COVID levels. So they were going to go from I think we approached 8.9 trillion at the top, and they were going to reduce that back to 4.1 trillion within a couple of years by reducing their balance sheet. And I thought that was insane, and I didn't believe that they had the ability to do it, given the government need to raise capital by selling new debt and new bonds every month. And sure enough, here we are, where they had reduced by maybe $400 billion. They added it all right back in order to solve the debt ceiling issue. And this was part of the reason that Fitch downgraded the U.S. dollars, because they're saying that this is an insane game. We wait to the last minute, we get to the cliff, and then we come up with a solution. And the idea that we push it to that point where we're about to go over the cliff into debt and completely destroy the U.S. economy, we come up with an answer at the last minute. And Fitch is saying, you can't run a country like that. That is not a comfortable way to provide confidence to the U.S. and the world that the government will continue to be able to make its payments. And, so the first, I would say, in a series of problems is a U.S. downgrade, which we are now seeing the first one. There may be more to follow. And again, this is sort of being shrugged off, which is interesting. I mean, the economy is effectively ignoring that the stock market doesn't like it. The stock market took this more seriously than the dollar did. In fact, the dollar went up this morning. So that's kind of bizarre. The next thing that would happen is an actual default where the government misses a payment. Then we really experience a downward spiral that would be very difficult to catch. And talk about, trying to catch a falling knife. Yeah. That would be insanely difficult and dangerous.
So, Fred, what is their end game? What do you think they're thinking at night when they get their 40-year-old scotch out there and try to figure this out? Do they have an end game? Do they just going to keep going until, as Andrew used to say, they'll run out of zeros? I mean, what do you think?
First of all, can you tell me where I can get a bottle of 40-year-old scotch?
Well, I just... Wow. Do they have it that old? I don't know. 40. I think they do. I think they actually have 40.
Well, that would be something. Anyway, what's their end game? So,
what do you think? What are they going to do?
They're sort of stuck here, okay? So they know that they have an existing situation they have to move forward from. They can't unwind it. Like you said, they just can't make this disappear. So they have to continue to move forward with where they are. Meanwhile, a couple of things are happening simultaneously. The amount that the government is deficit spending is increasing. The deficit has increased about 25% this year alone in the last 9 months. So that's a massive amount of additional government spending that's taken hold. Simultaneously, they, of course, know that there's still an inflation problem higher than what the Fed's target is. They're still trying to target 2% inflation, 2.1. And even statistically, according to their numbers, which I think are seriously skewed, we're pushing 5%. So they've experienced these issues on a regular basis, and have to make short-term decisions to try to address the problems as they come up. I agree with you. I don't think there's really any natural solution that can be derived to be able to resolve the problem. So that means we'll have to just continue to print money as fast as possible to keep staving off disaster without creating too much inflation too rapidly to force the Fed to continue to jack up rates. I mean, we're at 20-year highs in interest rates. I mean, the people who locked in mortgage rates when they were under, 4%, 3% and change, that was just brilliant. And they're sitting on a wonderful asset right now because rates now are, I think I suggested earlier this year, we would probably be close to 8% on mortgage rates by the end of the year. And here we are in August, and we're 7+% already.
Is it 7 for a 30-year fix? Well, and so, and this has a double whammy effect, doesn't it? Doesn't this slow housing a bit, which is a big deal? Because people say, well, I'm not going to get out of my 3% mortgage and buy another house at 7. They don't want,
exactly.
They don't want to do that,
an impact. In other words, they don't want to do that. The Fed's raised rates significantly larger than anybody expected. And can you imagine with all the rate hikes that the Fed has instituted, if it had not had any impact anywhere in the economy?
Wow.
That really would have been a problem because that would have meant that the Fed's, tools are not working. So it's like shooting a shotgun at a target, but the gun is empty. You're just pulling the trigger and nothing's happening. If the Fed had continued to pull that trigger without any impact on anything in the economy, this would have been much worse. So after all of the rate hikes, we are beginning to see some things happening. But the labor market has been really stubborn. For the first time in years, it effectively is the situation right now where if you want a job, there's a job to be had.
Yeah.
We're not short of jobs now. So that's very powerful. But the labor market is still super strong. That does not help the Fed. But there is signs that the economy has slowed a little bit from all the rate hikes the Fed has instituted. And that's a positive thing. But it hasn't slowed enough to beat back the inflation to the Fed's target, which means that, the thought process would be, you would imagine they would be leaning toward, in the future, continually raising rates. But they're saying that they're coming to the end, and people are talking about the fact that they might start lowering them again soon, because they've overdone it. Inflation's still too high. Now we're going to head towards a slowing economy that's too slow, and we need to stimulate the economy, so we have to lower rates. Again, this is sort of like this walking a tightrope. I have been arguing for 2 years that the idea that we're going to come out of this without a hiccup and that the Fed's going to pull this game off, they're going to magically know that magic number of how many times to raise rates and how far to go, but not do too much. I just find that hard to believe that we're going to pull this off.
Yeah, I agree. And I'm just in the bleachers, and I see nothing. So this is interesting and a good place to say it. Ricky is in Seattle. So I've been reading a lot about the idea that the central bank digital currency is going to be the result of all of this. And Patrick asked about the end game. Is that their end game? It could be, right? They could be saying, well, we give and let's just do this digital currency thing and we'll make it all work. I don't know.
But that doesn't make anything work.
No, I know it doesn't, but the people will.
You know what I mean?
Right?
I don't get that because, yes, I understand the idea that we're moving toward a digital currency, and I think that's probably, just from a technology point, inevitable. But I don't think that solves anything.
No, it
just allows them to do this without the ability of the general public to be able to follow the money trail.
Right.
Because you and I can still look at the Federal Reserve's economic data. We can still look at Fred. And we can look at the amount of money that they print. But if we go digital, that's lost to us. So I have a real fundamental problem with the idea that the digital economy somehow solves the problem. It's not like we magically switch from paper to digital money and that all the other debt that existed is wiped out. It's not. It's still there. We still have to make good on payments to bondholders. We still have to pay interest payments on debt that exists. We still have to make good on obligations to the underfunded liabilities that we have. So nothing changes except the technical method that commerce is conducted.
And as you said, and keeping it where nobody knows what's going on, that gives you a little leeway, doesn't it, Fred, where you can be putting out little digits more than people know about, but I agree. I mean, you have $33 trillion in bonded debt. You got to pay that. I mean, that you got to pay them.
Right. So whether I pay you with a digital dollar or I write you a check or transfer the money wire to your account, again, that doesn't change anything. So I understand the concerns of digital money, and I share those concerns.
A lot of concerns.
But I don't think that the changeover to that suddenly solves the problem. So, if people are thinking that once we get to that point, that somehow all the previous issues have evaporated, I think they're missing the picture there, because that's not the case.
Well, you know what they'll do? The government will sell you on the idea that this is going to save you.
Well, it's always convenience, right?
Oh, of course. This is going to
It's
save
always
you.
convenience. Technological advances are always based on convenience.
feel
But I have to tell you anecdotally, what was it? It was the 90s, and I have to remind myself that was 30 years ago, because I keep saying it was 5-10 years. No, it was 30 years ago. So as a joke, we used to go to retail stores and say, "Hey, you guys take cash," and everybody laughed. It was literally just a joke in the 90s. If you went to a retail store and said, "Hey, do you guys take cash?" If you go anywhere now, I don't care if it's a deli, a coffee shop, a car dealership, a retail store, and if you walk in there and say, "Hey, do you guys take cash?" you get a serious response. They actually think for a moment and say, either yes, we do, or no, we don't. And some places don't. But the idea that that has actually become a thing where it used to be a joke is really interesting to me, that we've evolved that far, because I've been around long enough to have watched the advent of the loss of knowledge that I think occurs over time. People forget history. It's a horrible process of human nature that we forget history.
Yeah.
And there's the old expression, those who forget history are doomed to repeat it. So we've removed ourselves so far from the original gold and silver standards that people forget there ever was one. There's a whole generation of people that have never seen a silver or gold coin, used as currency in their lifetime. So we're looking now at a situation where people are going to forget at some point in the future that we ever had paper money.
Yeah.
And they'll laugh about, "Oh, you guys used to use these pieces of paper to conduct commerce. How silly is that?
How silly
How bizarre
is that?" So, just in general, who are the big buyers of treasuries? Would it be hedge fund? Pension funds. They're the big buyers, right?
First is the U.S. is the other foreign governments.
Foreign governments, China, Russia, blah blah blah. Not Russia,
Yeah.
but I think they still hold some. And
Oh yeah.
That's the biggest.
Then
number.
come the hedge funds.
Then the
now
hedge
you take
funds
BlackRock, for example. They now have, you ready? $1 trillion worth of assets under their umbrella. $1 trillion. One hedge fund.
They're not treasury bonds, but just their own assets.
No, just everything they
Okay.
own. But my point being that these hedge funds are becoming so large that they can impact an economic environment now much more than ever before. But they are big buyers. And then you have banking institutions that also do the same thing, that buy large amounts of treasuries, pension accounts, which use treasuries as a safe haven. Because again, people are struggling and saying, well, here's an economy, we have money, and there's a ton of money in cash floating around. I mean, trillions and trillions of dollars in cash that people don't know what to do with. So when the banking system faltered in the spring, and a lot of people decided they were uncomfortable with banks, trillions of dollars moved over into mutual funds because they were affording interest payments at about 4.5%, which at the time was higher than you can get in almost any other obligation. Now the rates have gone up on 2-year and 5 years to where they're comparable to those rates. They're over 4% now. Even 10-year money is close to 4%. So you can park money now in a bond, and it's actually becoming a popular investment program again for the first time in decades, because the rates have gone up enough to where it makes sense.
Yeah, if you get 5%,
and you got money, you got to park it somewhere.
Yeah, you get 5% here. I'll give you $1 million. I'll just sit on this puppy for a while. I guess
Sure, it's a guaranteed 5% coming from a government institution that, as far as we know, has the ability to make its obligations good. And as long as that is the case, but what happens when, and I've alluded to this before, when that confidence erodes, even before the technical ability of them to repay the debt is gone, I think the confidence would happen first. Right? I mean, we would see that crack before the actual crack.
Sure.
So the first thing that would show up is a splintering of the psychology of people saying, well, if I don't believe that the government has an ability to repay its obligations, I'm not parking my money in government debt. So I'm going to look for an alternative. And what's going to happen is that people will seek out anything that will pay them any kind of return on their money. And this leads to an awful lot of speculation and some issues and problems that will blow up at people, I'm sure, because a lot of these speculative things that pay higher interest rates are going to explode. So with higher rates always come higher risk. That's always been the nature of money. The lower the rate, generally speaking, the more comfortable and safe the process is and the product is. So, if you're looking for higher yield, you're also accepting higher risk. That means, problems can exist that normally wouldn't be an issue. But yeah, people are still loading up on treasuries now because the yields have now gone high enough to where they exceed what the banks are willing to pay. And, for those banks that said, well, we see the game and we can figure out how to get people to give us their money, all we have to do is pay higher rates than what the street is paying. Well, the banks that did that also found themselves in trouble when confidence in the banks dissipated and people tried to redeem those debts and obligations from the banks. And the banks found themselves saying, okay, wait, we don't actually have enough money to make all this good. We have to sell some of our assets, but the assets we're holding aren't worth what we paid for them because they were lower yielding rates that now rates have gone up and the new rates pay more. So we're getting offers of 80 cents or 70 cents on the dollar for what we have. We're losing billions just trying to sell off obligations that we have to make good on the interest payments that we promised people. So this all creates an interesting problem when people are seeking out higher interest rates.
Where is that no state make anything other than gold and silver a payment of debt? What happened to that? I mean, Article 1, Section, what is it? Article 1, Section 10? Article
1, Section 10. 10. That's it. What happened to that? Here's the weird part. There's a supremacy clause in the U.S. Constitution that says the Constitution reigns supreme over federal law, over state law, over local law. So unless a Supreme Court case overturns a constitutional provision and has set a precedent through the courts, that still stands as law in the United States. So it has not changed. That still stands. So technically speaking, we are getting away with all of this because we're effectively ignoring that. And the way we get past that is that Congress authorized the power to issue money and control money through this banking system called the Federal Reserve that afforded them that opportunity to sort of set that obligation of maintaining a gold standard against money up to the side. And it created a sort of a segregated system to where we said, well, yeah, that stands. So what we're going to do is we're not going to create dollars that would then be obligated to follow that constitutional obligation. We'll create notes that come through the Federal Reserve System. They will look like dollars, they'll act like dollars because we say so, and we say that the Federal Reserve will stand behind this system and we will provide the liquidity for anybody who believes in it. But effectively, they sort of sidestepped the constitutional requirements. And believe it or not, it was that sidestepping of that original concept of locking money down to gold and silver that got me started in this business, because that was the first question that came to my mind when I was old enough to understand this, is how do these things exist together? How are they simultaneously in existence? You have a constitutional requirement, and yet we're ignoring it. So why hasn't somebody sued to protect the constitutional requirement? Well, the reason you can't is because they did set up this subset of currency that they created through the Federal Reserve banking system. It was a brilliant way to get around the problem. And, again, their rationale was to resolve the huge money problems that existed in that time, which was 1907. It was the big money panic of 1907 that set all this off. They ended up creating a commission through Congress to decide, how do we do this? What do we do? And the National Monetary Commission came up with an answer. They presented it to Congress, but everybody looked at it and said, look, this is an effort by bankers to suppress a constitutional requirement and effectively shift power and control of issuing money to them under the pretense of solving an economic problem. Doesn't that sound vaguely familiar?
Yeah.
And they've used this from time to time. Like I said, there's always the offer of convenience to push forward a new technology.
Yeah.
So we can consider the removal of that requirement of gold and silver and the issue of Federal Reserve notes as the same thing we're experiencing now, which is we're going to convince the public we should move to a digital currency and that, we should not worry about the obligations that the Constitution requires. I think that's a flawed concept. And this is why I believe for some 40 years that individual Americans should own physical gold and silver coins. I believe it's the only thing we have as a way for us to counter the influences that are exterior to the public. And since the government won't keep that requirement of providing that gold and silver against money, and they're forcing us to use these notes that are unbacked, and then we create these massive problems by having done this, allowing the government to run up these huge debts to the point where the interest payments become a significant issue and that we have obligations that exceed the ability of the government to repay. And we're left with $100 trillion worth of government obligations over the next decade. All of that could never, ever have happened. Under a standard that required gold and silver to be backing the money, because it wouldn't have allowed for that rapid expansion of debt. Congress would have had to control its spending. And perhaps people could argue, well, some things would not have been created. We wouldn't have had some government issue programs that people have utilized. But what's the payout? What's the benefit? What's the balance point?
Yeah,
these
you got to
programs
think
worthwhile?
you got to think about where did this $33 trillion go? Do we have roads and bridges and a solid Social Security system? No. We don't have anything to speak of. We got
nothing to show for it.
Nothing to show for it. That's crazy,
right.
Fred.
Now, that would have been a far better way to have spent that money. In other words, let's say they had done what you're suggesting, actually done something with those funds and built roads and built bridges and built highways and done things like that. Well, yes, we would have spent that money, but it would have resulted in a much stronger economy. It would have increased the number of jobs, and we would have ended up with an actual tangible thing we could point to and say, we spent, but look what we got for it.
Yeah.
So we could pose that question: what did we get for the $32 trillion worth of bond debt we created?
Just more debt is all we got. Social Security Trust Fund has been looted for years. I don't know what do we have for it? We have
nothing. And how many people in Congress are willing to say, well, we need to curtail the spending?
Yeah.
They all do it when the political year comes up. Of course, during political season, they'll all tell you, oh, this is, not good. And, we need to make a change. And, they all have their high expressions for how they're going to be better, do better. But there has not been a president since, I think you got to go back to Lyndon Johnson or John Kennedy, that has not spent more money than every president before him combined had spent. That has been the trend since Lyndon Johnson. And every president that has come into office has made promises to, I'm going to bring down the government spending, and we're going to get better control over, what's happening in Congress in Washington. But the reality is something they cannot really do and deal with, because it means they have to turn to the public and say, okay, this has gotten so bad that we now have to start really, we have to start making some cuts.
Yeah.
So who wants to be, the one that takes the hit? Should it be the wealthy people? Should it be the poor people? Should it be the people that are on the government T? Should it be, how do we curtail the government spending? And it's politically suicidal to say to retired people, okay, we'll start with you. We'll start with this Social Security. And you paid into it. Now you're 70, 80 years old, and you've been paying this thing for 40 years, all your life, under the promise that you get this money back at the end of your lifespan. And now we have to tell you we don't have it. So thanks for playing, but you're screwed. We don't have the money.
Yeah, you're talking about a way of not getting elected. Boy, you don't mess with that. Right? Yeah. But
that's not going to happen. Yeah. So what's left? What else can Congress do? Can they cut the Department of Defense budget? That one's difficult. Again, now you're going to have a political argument of what is necessary for the U.S. to do as a country. How much do we need in a Defense Department budget? Do we need to have enough money to be able to support all of the military that is all over the world and the expansion of the military, because we need to provide safety and security to the public? And because we're in a worldwide economy now, things that happen, terrorism all over the world, it requires a substantial Department of Defense budget. So that's hard to cut. So if you can't cut Social Security or welfare or Medicaid or Medicare,
Or
and
interest
you can't
payments.
cut the Department of Defense budget, what's left that is large enough to have any kind of impact on government spending? There are only little minor things that you can attack, and they all are, maybe worthy, but none of them are large enough to actually deal with the size of this problem. And, I think it was a couple months ago, I mapped this out. I think we're looking at a $50 trillion bonded debt within the next 10 years. I'm going to say 9 years now, because this is really increasing a lot more rapidly than even I anticipated.
Wow. And if you do that at 5%, what's that, 2.5 trillion, something like that?
Just think how rapidly that's going to grow.
Yeah.
Now, meanwhile, here's a very interesting quirk of life. In the midst of all this, silver coins pre-1965 have been carrying a little premium, let's call it, a price over the amount of metal that they're made of, which is, I believe, a fundamentally correct way of viewing their value, because you have a limited and fixed supply of these things that can't be expanded. So those premiums were climbing, a little here and there, a little here and there, and they kept going and kept going and kept going. Mm-hmm. At one point, we had premium expansions that put silver coins at about $10 over the price of silver itself for every ounce. The premiums have been coming down the past 4 or 5 months.
Really?
They've been dramatically reducing over the last few months, to the point now where the premiums over melt are the lowest they've been in the last 3 years.
What's that about?
This has been a very interesting quirk. It's the first time I've seen this in a long, long time. But we're down to a point now where the premiums are down to about $2 over the price of silver from what had peaked at almost 10. That means it's much more affordable now to buy silver coins over the price of silver than it had been even a year or two ago.
Wow.
The price of silver keeps creeping up, but the premiums have been reduced. So we have a great buying opportunity for anybody who's looking to buy silver right now.
Yeah.
It's unprecedented, and I can't imagine it's going to last long. But while it exists, coupled with everything else going on with the dollar being downgraded, the debt climbing as rapidly as it is, I see this as a wonderful time to make that transitional shift, get out of those paper dollars and get into some physical silver coins. It looks like a terrific time for people to do that.
Cool. So how do you do it? Now, you have pre-65 dimes, quarters, half silver dollars, right?
Yes.
Yeah. And they're in bags, is that correct? Bags?
Yeah, the reference of a bag is an old expression that comes from the days when banks used to put $1,000 in face value into burlap bags.
Oh.
So 1,000 face value would represent 10,000 dimes, 10 dimes per dollar. Mm-hmm. 4,000 quarters or 2,000 half dollars. That's what we call a bag. Although people refer to bags physically, because of the physical entity of the bag, the reference actually technically refers to 1,000 face value. So a face value $1,000 bag of half dollars right now is about $25,000. And I think that's an amazing price range for the silver content and the fact that the premiums have been reduced, because at one point it was almost $31,000 for the same bag, with the price of silver being relatively close to where it is now. So, the dollar rallies a little bit, even though the downgrade occurs from the credit rating agencies, the government debt has gone up. People are sort of trying to put this stuff together. And meanwhile, quietly in the background, the premiums have been reduced on silver coins. And I think that's great, because a lot of people have been looking for a way to add silver coins without having to pay large premiums. It's what's driven them away from a lot of the more modern coins that carry really stiff premiums, 50% or 80% over the melt value of silver. So we're down now to the lowest premiums I've seen in years. I think people should definitely be taking advantage of that.
And what do you attribute the lower premiums over the last? Why do that happen?
I've talked to some of the largest dealers in the industry. Most of them are sort of just alluding to the idea that it may have something to do with the supply chain issues, that at some point the supply chain problem had also filtered its way into the coin industry, and that even just getting capital moving around was becoming more expensive to the point where premiums were climbing. It's certainly not a supply-demand problem, because demand is higher than it has been. So it's odd that these things are happening simultaneously. But the shifts like this happen from time to time. But I do think it represents a good buying opportunity for anybody who's been, sitting on the fence.
And you can call Fred, and we'll give you his phone number in a second. I'll give you a phone number right now while we're thinking about it.
800-878-COIN, 2646.
A coin, 264. So I look on the chart now, the New York spot price for silver, my computer, $23.74 an ounce. So somebody spends $10,000 or something for coin silver. Fred Dashevsky, does the silver spot price have to go up a lot to make that a good deal to buy now or not?
No, it doesn't have to move a lot. A couple dollars in movement in silver prices, and the cost of getting in and out are covered, and everything after that becomes profitable. But I look at it more instead of from any short-term gains that may occur. I've always believed that the idea is that I am growing in my concern over the future value of money and how rapidly it's deteriorating, and I just don't want to see the American public screwed over by a system they have no control over, by having accidentally denominated too much of their own wealth in forms of paper that are eroding in value very rapidly. And, the odd part is that, we look at statistics for inflation, but if you talk to people anecdotally, they experience it now in the real world to the point where it's hard to ignore. We used to be able to have inflation kind of more hidden amongst the statistical data. But if people didn't experience it because it was subtle and slow, it was low enough to where it just didn't show up in day-to-day life to a point where it's recognizable, you get away with it a lot more. But nowadays, I think most people in their real life, they go to a supermarket, they go out to buy any kind of products, goods and services, everything, lumber, paper, tuna fish, I don't care what it is. Everything costs so much more than even earlier this year that you can't ignore the inflation problem. And as people age, they need to address that, because the rate at which this problem exists is going to exhibit itself in a much more rapid pace than what we're experiencing now. It's going to be much more devastating, much more quickly in reducing the buying power that people carry. They need to have a counterbalance to that. They need to carry a portion of their wealth in something that is going to increase in buying power along with that decreasing paper money. And nothing works better in that regard than physical gold and silver coins.
Is it just a matter of having these guys in a safe, and this is going to be your mother lode of a backstop if things really get crazy? Is that why you want it, or are there other reasons to have these?
Well, I look at it as, first of all, as that hedge, right? Hedge. So this is why we only suggest that this be a part of what people do. I've never recommended that people take 80 or 90% of their money and buy gold and silver coins. I think they need a percentage, 15, 20%, depending upon how aggressive they want to be. Some people now are looking at a 30% level and keeping 70 or 75% of their money in the standard things while they carry a portion in that physical gold and silver, because they're trying to counterbalance 5 years from now or 10 years from now the discrepancy in what paper money will buy today versus then. Mm-hmm. Then there's the profit, that people look for, and that's fine. So I think the idea is really about protecting one's wealth, about preserving the buying power of money you've already earned, because there's nothing worse than having worked for years or decades, saving the dollars like you were supposed to, doing everything right. You did your job. You didn't just wildly spend your money. You didn't go to Vegas and blow the mortgage payments. Right. You did everything right. You raised your family. You bought your house. You paid your mortgage down. You did all these things and try to save a couple of bucks. And then at the end of the line, you go to spend that money, and it buys, every dollar that you save buys a dime's worth of goods and services. That didn't work very well. People need another method of preserving the money that they're earning for their future. And again, I think this problem is going to become so visible in a matter of a few years that it'll be impossible to ignore it. And we're still sitting at a really tiny percentage of Americans that physically own gold and silver. It's really rather small, and I think it has a lot of room to grow.
We used to talk about MZM. Can you still get that chart online?
I think the Fed has stopped producing some numbers. Like, remember they used to produce M1, M2, and M3, and then they stopped showing us M3, and then they made us do the math to do M2. But I believe MZM is still available.
Let me see. Well, I clicked on it, Fred, MZM. But I was just wondering, this is called money with a zero maturity. I think I heard somewhere on a radio money show that it was like $15 trillion now. But I can't pull up the chart right now. I don't see it. Money stock.
Yeah, so remember that we look at the funds that we have in obligations based upon their time frame.
Right.
You have a 2-year obligation, a 5-year obligation. You have things that are due today. Money with zero maturity, money with 5-year maturity, 10-year, 30-year. It's just getting really hard to convince people to take longer-term maturities. So an awful lot of the government debt, one of the gimmicks that they played was to shift a lot of their long-term obligations into shorter-term bonds. That was probably a disaster, but they did it. So they moved from 10-year and 30-year bonds and notes into 2-year and 5-year T-bills. So that means the obligations come up much more rapidly, and that means that they have to be able to repay those much more quickly. So a lot of stuff is shifted to the shorter-term end of the yield curve, and that is very disconcerting because, again, it just creates a lot more obligations that have to be repaid a lot more quickly. So the debt ceiling limit, which we've recently expanded, we're still dealing with issues that are coming due in November and December this year, just because of some of the trickery that Janet Yellen used in order to get us past this. And then we've expanded the problem to go out for another year or so, maybe 2, and then we're going to face the problem all over again. And again, what's going to happen? The same thing that happened the last 5 or 6 times that we got to that point where Congress had run out of money. And they're faced with, okay, you're holding a bond, and unless Congress tells me I can raise the debt limit and create more money, I can't pay you. And, God forbid the U.S. government should default on any obligation at any point. That is far worse than a credit rating drop by one of the rating agencies.
Oh, you'll like this, Fred, and ladies and gentlemen. Last time we had the MZM number, which was 2021, I think like 21 trillion 2 years ago, 21 trillion, and now they discontinued it. So it says right here, discontinued. We're not going to tell you anymore. Okay, you guys. So this is.
See, it's a great game to play when you get to control the information.
Wow.
So it makes it much more difficult to pay attention. This is why I was saying that I think even anecdotally now, inflation is hard to hide. You can play those games, on the big picture, but when people experience it in real life, it's getting hard to ignore it, and that's going to make the job of the Federal Reserve much more difficult.
Like even look at this, 2000. So 23 years ago, money with the zero maturity, this hot money they call it. This is money that people can get really quickly, right? Whatever, checking accounts, right? They can get it and spend it, right, if they want to.
Right.
Is that correct? It was only $5 trillion. So 4 times that. So what does this mean to us philosophically or from a money perspective, that people are just holding on because they're not happy, they're afraid, all the above, they're concerned, they don't know what's going to go on?
Well, that's a big part of it. So when the rates were too low, when they were 2% at the banks and 1.5% at the banks, or under 1% in some cases for a while, nobody really wanted to keep their money in the bank. So, they end up sitting on large amounts of cash, waiting for the next opportunity, whatever they may turn out to be. And, that part of that went into the real estate market, drove prices higher, and prices for real estate were going crazy in America for 4 or 5 years. I mean, it was leapfrogging down here to the point where it was almost insane. I mean, a property would come up for sale, someone would buy it, they'd relist it without doing a damn thing and get more money for it, a couple weeks later. And that would happen 2 or 3 times on top of itself. That was because, again, there was this drive of capital looking for something to do when rates that were being paid by banking institutions were too low. And, no matter what you believe about the inflation rate, everybody believes that the rates are higher than what the banks are paying. So you end up with piles of cash. There's a massive amount of money sitting in the U.S. banking system right now from people who have not been able to figure out what to do with their capital.
I saw a video of a fellow that wanted to get $1 million in cash, cash. It took him like 2 months to get it from the bank. 2 months. They said, well, we don't have that kind of stuff around here.
We don't do
We don't do
You want what?
You want what?
You want cash?
Yeah, but he got it. It was about, and he had a picture of it. He had about 2 months to get it. 2 months. Wow.
2 months. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, that's the longest time frame I've heard. And I have heard stories, several of them in the past year, of a number of these large transactions that were trying to happen. And, I mean, the first thing that happens, you walk into the bank and say, I want $1 million or $5 million or $10 million in cash. And they were like, uh-oh. Well, we don't have that kind of money. And, the people will say, well, wait a minute, I deposited that. Where is it? Oh, well, we've loaned that out, 9 or 10 times over, in fact. So, yeah, we don't have that. But we can put it together. It's just going to take some time.
Takes a little time.
I
don't even think you
the
can
old
get
days
over
used to go to
10,000.
Vegas and say, hey, I want to take $1 million out of a checking account. Even then it would take a half a day.
Isn't there even a limit on what you can take out these days, like 10,000 or something like that?
Well, the bank can't limit you to take your own money out of your account, effectively. But what they can do is just stall the crap out of the process.
Yeah.
And say, yeah, okay, we'll get you your money, but we can't do that today. That's going to take some time. And that used to be a day. It used to be if you walked in at 9 o'clock in the morning, by 5 o'clock in the afternoon, you could probably walk out with your briefcase full of cash.
Really?
Now?
No way.
Yeah. I mean, for those that have that kind of money, it would be an interesting experiment just for, shits and giggles. Walk into your bank and say, hey, I'd like to withdraw $1 million in cash and I need it today. That's not happening. Well, and that's a little weird, right? This is your money.
That is weird.
And the bank's saying you can't have it.
And someday they're going to say, what do you say? You want these digits? We got this. We'll put it on your phone. How about that? Do you want that? No, thank you. Wouldn't it be? And these are just pieces of paper, dead instruments, notes. They're not really of any value. They're just dead instruments, and you can't even get those, right? Boy.
Right.
I tell you what.
So look at the banking institution as a whole and see how it shifted and changed.
Wow.
The way that they operate now, the reserves that they carry. Most of the banks are finding themselves parking their capital with the Federal Reserve. Putting their money on account at the Fed because they get paid that Fed funds rate. And, they'd rather make a couple points on the interest payments than leaving the money sitting in the bank and loaning it out even. So, it's an interesting situation, but it goes back to that same point of this transition away from sound money. It creates a lot of these kinds of problems. But, where is the value? And, how far can we go before, if really people start questioning whether they actually can get their funds from a banking institution.
It's a little weird.
That could be dangerous real quick. I mean, look how fast the psychology shifted in spring. You had 3 bank failures, just 3.
BSV.
And it was enough. It was enough to shake the confidence in the entire world of the ability of the banking system to be able to give us the money that we want and whether they were carrying our capital safely. And, how did they protect it? Well, some of them did stupid stuff. Bought low-yielding bonds in an environment where interest rates were rising. Well, any economic student in college could have told you that doesn't work. So, we're creating our own problems. But the government right now is really in a very bizarre situation. They, like I said, there's no simple solution for them to slow down their spending. They can't raise enough capital by increasing tax rates. They've done the math. They, even if they tax the wealthiest people in the country, 70% of the money they earn every year, it wouldn't put a dent into the problem.
No.
So if you can't raise the money through increasing taxes, and you're having a hard time getting the money by selling debt instruments because your obligations are so vast that people are beginning to question your ability to repay, and you can't reduce the government spending enough to make any substantial change, there is only one solution left, and that's just simply to print and print and print. And that's fine from the government's point of view, but it doesn't work very well for the average person who doesn't have a printing press.
I think it's an interesting question from Derek. I watched a video on YouTube the other night, and the fellow said that you can actually sell your mortgage, not sell your home, but just sell the mortgage to someone else. Does Fred know? Has he ever heard of this? And can you do this?
Yeah, you absolutely can do it.
What do you mean, sell the mortgage? What are you talking
about? A mortgage
about?
payment that pays, let's say, that is only costing you, let's call it 3%, is an absolute valuable asset. People will buy out that mortgage and utilize the ability of only having to make 3% interest payments on that debt and then roll that capital over to something else that's going to pay them a higher yield. It's actually becoming an asset to own a mortgage.
No, wait a minute.
Because the rates are locked in low.
So say you got a 30-year 3%, baby, everybody. You could actually take that mortgage, sell it to somebody, but the house that is backing the mortgage goes with it, correct?
Well, the debt gets paid off. So, for example, the banking institution that's holding that note gets paid.
Oh, you'd have to pay it off. You just can't sell the mortgage as is.
Well, you sell the mortgage to the second person who uses that additional ability to get higher rates. So it becomes an asset. It's like, for example, can I sell an instrument that pays interest payments to a third party? Well, of course I can. If there's somebody willing to buy that instrument because they know that they can get a better yield by utilizing that underlying capital. Again, remember that secondary market for mortgage payments, that was huge during the 2008 debacle.
Was it?
Mortgage-backed securities and things of that nature. So we can definitely create a market environment to be able to resell in a secondary market an existing interest payment on a mortgage loan. The same way that the banks utilized that opportunity during the 2008 problem, to the large extent, to the point where they had sold so many of them that it created its own issue. But yeah, any kind of asset could be valued and somebody might be willing to buy it and figure out a way to make a couple bucks because, again, it's a locked-in rate. And again, I think for anybody that did that, you're in great position. I think that was just a wonderful way for those people that refinanced,
really?
7% mortgages down to 3%. It's just so smart.
Doesn't the home that's with that mortgage, that's the asset that the bank has on their books, right? So you sell the mortgage, what happens to the home goes to the person who owns the mortgage, right?
Well, the home remains in the homeowner's possession. Again, you can easily sell off the instrument, right? the borrowing, the capital itself, because that itself is an asset. It's a tool, and it can be resold several times over. So whoever holds that in the end will have the obligation to make those payments, but the homeowner would retain ownership of his home. He's just selling the debt instrument that he used to buy it. And again, there is a secondary market for interest-paying investments. People will buy those things because, again, they can utilize that capital and add to their own reserves by, again, utilizing the fact that these are fixed at these low rates. They can now utilize that capital and get a higher return.
So the bank doesn't have a say in that. You could just sell it to somebody. They can't control who owns it.
Yeah, you may run into some issues. A lot of it's going to come down to how your mortgage is set up. Some of the banks may not allow you to resell a mortgage instrument like that. But again, if they get paid off in full, I doubt they'll care. So,
I see what you're saying. But it would have to be paid off. It's not like the buyer can just hang on to the mortgage and make the payments and do what he wants. He needs to pay it off for that to work.
Well, there are a couple of ways it could be done. So a lot of it has to do with the legality of how the mortgage was set up in the first place. Some banks are much more straightforward. Some of the banking institutions have already divvied out portions of these loans that they make where they actually don't have full ownership of the debt. They parceled it out in pieces and parts, sometimes the interest payments, sometimes the principal, sometimes the administrative fees, just like they did when they bundled the mortgage-backed securities. They busted these things into pieces and utilized those and combined them together to make a whole new instrument. So, in any market environment, someone's going to find a way to squeeze an extra dollar out of every way we can. And in this environment, an asset, believe it or not, a debt instrument, which normally would be considered that, a debt instrument, debt, is now actually an asset. So a 3% mortgage has now become actually an asset for people.
Interesting. Well, yeah. Well, finally, let's talk a little bit about your mainstay of business, which is gold and silver coins, mostly gold, right? Numismatics, real American money, and they go back and they're all graded, plastic in containers, third-party graded. What's the situation there as far as premiums, your stock, and do you have plenty to sell? Talk a bit about that before we go.
Well, nothing has changed in any of the premiums with the exception of again, I hate the expression, the junk silver, that lower
Currency
end
silver.
pre-65 just circulated coinage. There is the only place where premiums have come down. Everything else has remained about where it was. And the price of gold has been fairly stable between about 1940 to 1960. Again, I think it's going to start creeping up. We may see a breakout before the end of the year for several technical reasons, but the premiums have remained very stable on those and have continued to grow just a little bit over time. But there's just that one spot in the concept in all of the world's physical entities. It just happens to be taking place in that one area of the market. And I think that makes sense because that pre-65 silver coinage or the junk silver is the heavy weighted product that's the most difficult to ship.
Yeah.
So that's where the cost of shipping and management of it logistically is the greatest. So that's where the premiums have had, there's been an impact on premiums. Again, these things happen from time to time. They tend to be temporary, but at this point, the reduction is substantial enough to where I make a point of it to those that are interested in buying pre-65 silver coins. Besides the price of silver being lower at some previous point, this would now create the best buying opportunity we've seen in years for those that want to acquire pre-65 silver.
Uh-huh. And then we have to be clear that you do not deal in gold bars like Goldfinger and all that, and 10-ounce silver, none of that. That's bullion. You just do numismatics, right? Real American money. Made at the print.
I'm a fan of any form of physical gold or silver that people can own. I think it's far better than any form of paper money. But the problem I run into with bullion is the fact that the federal government has regulated that industry, and they continue to add more regulations as the years continue to move forward. So at first, it was merely a reporting requirement, filling out a 1099-B on those that sold that product, where I'm not required to do that on the silver coins or gold coins. I am required to do it on the bullion bars. But then they added more regulations where they tightened down. At first, it was a volume, that it became all transactions. Then they started doing it on a yearly basis. Any company that did $50,000 in both buying and selling combined, either or combined, once you cross that threshold, everything that you do then becomes reportable. So if you deal in that bullion world and cross that threshold, you have to start reporting all your transactions. And what bothers me about it is then after that came the AMLs, the anti-money laundering rules. And this is where it got really bizarre. So what they started to do to us as dealers is they did the same thing to the tellers at the banking system. They made the tellers liable to report what they call, quote unquote, suspicious transactions. So if you're a regular visitor to your bank, but suddenly do something that's a little out of the ordinary, the teller might suggest that that was a suspicious transaction and force you to report that transaction to Internal Revenue and require you to fill out forms instead of just doing the transaction. And I guarantee you, like we talked about before, asking for $1 million in cash would certainly constitute what they would deem a suspicious transaction.
Hey, George, this guy wants $1 million. Yeah,
yeah, nothing wrong with that.
Nothing wrong
so
with
with us, I'm supposed to know my customer. So here's how this is supposed to work. If somebody buys bullion bars from me, and then it turns out the money they used came from an illegal source because I allowed them to use my services to buy or sell that bullion product, I have facilitated in money laundering.
Oh, good.
Now, I become obligated to criminal penalty time, jail time, fines, fees, government fees. I don't want to deal with any of that.
No.
I don't see that there's any advantage in dealing with the bars. Again, if we ever get to a point where people are trying to conduct commerce, which, again, I don't think that's likely, but in any kind of scenario where you're trying to sell a silver bar, the first question that always comes up is, how do I know it's not lead painted? So what are we going to start doing? Drilling holes in the middle of these bars and assaying them on the spot to try to determine what they're made of? A silver quarter or a silver $50 is just something that people can recognize in real life. It's a lot easier to deal with. And incrementally, if you have a bag of silver $50, you have 2,000 coins, you could literally sell one at a time.
Yeah.
You could sell 100 of them. You could sell 1,000 of them. You could sell the whole bag. You have perfect flexibility where it's very difficult to take a 100-ounce bar and shave off a piece of it if you just wanted to raise a little bit of revenue.
Yeah.
So between these things and the fact that they can't make more silver coins, meaning that we've locked down the supply forever and ever and ever, that is a huge advantage for an investor who's putting this stuff away, because it affords us the possible potential to see higher values exceeding the increase in the metal itself.
Yeah, and the cool thing about the graded coins in the plastic, they are third-party, they're graded, and you know what they're worth. I mean, you can actually go online and get a pretty good idea of what somebody's willing to pay for them. You or a coin shop or anybody, right? I mean, it's
a visible market. That helps a lot of bit. There's transparency, and again, I love the idea of dealing in things that are, issued and remain under that constitutional requirement of a gold and silver standard. This is the original form of sound money. This was the idea that was originally imparted to the country. This is what we were supposed to maintain to avoid all of the current problems that we are experiencing in the financial world. None of these would have happened if we had sustained this sound money concept. And it's what the founding fathers were most concerned about, because their fear was not only how this would impact the public, but the fact that the influence over the value of money could end up being in the hands of either bankers or politicians.
Yeah.
And that's what they wanted to avoid. They didn't want a politician to be empowered to a point where he could affect the wealth of the public. They didn't want the banks to be in a position where they could affect the wealth of the public. They wanted a system that was, even and fair play and on a level playing field where nobody had an upper hand. So by instituting requirements for a gold and silver standard, you eliminated the possibility of anybody having control over the system. And now without that, we are experiencing exactly what they were most concerned about. Congress now controls how they spend money, and they can spend money they don't have because we don't have that sound money standard. We have a private banking institution that effectively controls the value of currency moving forward and the amount of it that exists, again, completely out of control of the public hands. So I think the only compensation left to the Americans are for them to own that actual physical, tangible asset and own it and have possession of that physical gold and silver coinage.
And that's what Fred does for a living. You can look at his little slide here. The phone number is 800-878-2646, U.S. Coin Capital with an O. It took me about 2 years to figure out that it was an O rather than an A, Fred. But,
like the building, as we like to say.
Like the building, like we like to say. So you can call Fred at 800-878-2646. Talk to Fred as someone on his staff, and you guys will take some time with people too, won't you?
We will. Yeah, we've spent a lot of time trying to make sure that people recognize and understand what's happening in the economy as much as we can. Obviously, this is difficult sometimes to impart this type of information to an average person.
Sure.
For those that have not kept up, a lot of people do listen to the news and they get bits and pieces of it. But again, fundamentally, this is not a system that people were supposed to have to work hard to understand. It was supposed to be basic and simple. And, the reasons that we've moved away from that notwithstanding, we are left with a system now that's rather complicated and sometimes difficult for people to grasp. So I don't mind taking the time to try to help people get that sense of understanding, because I think fundamentally, if people recognize the flaw in paper money, it's going to make perfect sense for them to want to diversify their assets.
Once you understand. If you're watching this video on BitChute, which is where we post them, you can pass on this link to people in your life that you think might be interested in owning some gold and silver, and Fred will take care of them. And you can also subscribe to the video and then hit the little bell, and we'll alert you every time we put a new one up. Mr. Dashevsky, thanks for being here. Glad to get you started and up and running.
Yep, happy we finally got the technology worked out again. We'll see what happens next month. Every month we seem to experience a few glitches, but we got through it.
We got through it. All right, Freddie, you take care. Thanks for being here. Thanks for being
here. You too, Patrick. Great to see you.
Nice to see you. Fred Dashevsky and the real world of money is what we talk about. And he's a good guy. And so check it out.